All right, sorry that I'm posting this so late, but this is just an introduction to the Vietnam War, and this is the Vietnam War test guide that you should have printed out. So I'm looking at a map of the Vietnam at the very last page, just so you can see it. So the northern border up by the Red River is connected to China, except this is a lot farther south than Korea. And because Korea also, when we talked about the Korean War, shared a border with China. And you see Laos here, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand. These countries make up what we call IndoChina. So starting at the top, Vietnam before 1800. This is just to really briefly say that the Vietnamese have always had a struggle for independence. Back in the time of Christ, the Vietnamese were fighting against the Chinese, the Han Dynasty. They had a couple of heroes called the Trung sisters who led them against the Chinese. Then through the ages, in the 1200s, it was the Mongols who were after Vietnam. China came back again in the Ming Dynasty. And so they have a history of having to fight for their freedom, to be independent. I think that's important to note. Letter B, the French arrive. So in the 1850s, the French, along with lots of other European countries, are very imperialistic. We studied this time and time again. So imperialism is when a stronger nation invades a weaker nation for resources and for markets, right, to sell their goods. And so the French, the British were in China in the Opium Wars. And so the French went into Indochina. So the British had India and China, and then the French went after Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and Thailand, etc. And the French arrive in the 1850s, and they capture Saigon in the south, down here. And then over the next several decades, they continue to spread out and conquer Vietnam, eventually all of Vietnam, and also Laos and Cambodia, and they create what they call French Indochina. And the French were not, they were very egotistical, arrogant, imperialistic controllers of Vietnam, right? So they limited education to the elite. They taxed the people. They did put roads and railroads and things in, but the Vietnamese people grew, a lot of Vietnamese people who weren't benefiting from the French grew to hate the French. And the French weren't there to make friends with the Vietnamese. They were there to exploit the Vietnamese. And that was clear to everyone who lived there. So some of the big cities, Saigon, Hanoi in the north, Hue here, in the middle, the ancient capital of Vietnam, they were all had a heavy French influence, so buildings, and then Catholicism. So Vietnam, being so often controlled by China, was Buddhist predominantly, and then Catholic missionaries from the French had converted at least the educated upper class to Catholicism. So there's a divide. You have poor peasants who are Buddhist, who hated the French, and then you have upper class Catholics who are benefiting from the French. And so there's a divide in Vietnam along those social classes. There was throughout French control of Vietnam, the Vietnamese did try several times to get their independence back. In 1931, there was an uprising that was brutally put down by the French, which just created more hatred. Now, what finally served to break the grasp of the French over Vietnam was World War II. So in World War II, obviously the French quickly collapsed to the Germans, and the Japanese, if you remember, invaded Indochina around 1940. It's part of the reason why the United States stopped sending scrap metal and oil to Japan, is because of their invasion of uh, Indochina. And so when the Japanese, they were obviously no better than the French. They were there to subjugate the Vietnamese and to take their food. And so this brought on a time of famine and oppression because of the Japanese. So the North Vietnamese, especially, were dying of starvation because the Japanese were seizing all their food. And when World War II was over, the Vietnamese quickly took control of their country and declared their independence. And this was very similar, if you remember, in the Spanish-American War. The Filipino leader, Emilio Aguinaldo, he helped the United States defeat the Spanish. And then once the Spanish were gone, he quickly declared the Philippines to be independent. And then we were like, whoa, hold on. And then we took over the Philippines, and he turned in from our ally to our enemy. Well, somewhat similarly, in Vietnam, we had an ally in Vietnam. His name was Ho Chi Minh. That wasn't his real name. His original name was Nguyen Vo Giap, but he changed it to Ho Chi Minh, which has something. I think it means the enlightened one. I can't remember. I should remember. But anyway, Ho Chi Minh was a very charismatic leader in Vietnam. He had done a lot of traveling. He'd been in the United States, worked all kinds of jobs. He'd been in England. He'd been in France. He'd been to the Soviet Union. He was heavily influenced by Vladimir Lenin and communism. And obviously, he had this passionate desire to have a free Vietnam, especially free of French control. And during World War II, we collaborated with Ho Chi Minh because we wanted, our pilots were flying in and out of China fighting the Japanese, and we wanted his help rescuing pilots and spying on the Japanese, etc. And he was willing to do that, and we provided him weapons and things in return. In 1945, Ho Chi Minh was desperately ill, I think from malaria. And so we parachuted in a team from the OSS. The OSS was basically the CIA. So we parachute these secret agents into Vietnam. We find Ho Chi Minh deathly ill. We treat him, and he recovers. And so we took pictures with him. We're buddies, more or less, with a common enemy of Japan. And of course, Ho Chi Minh wants America's support for Vietnamese independence, just like Aguinaldo did in the Philippines in 1898. So when the Vietnamese under Ho Chi Minh declare independence after World War II, he actually quotes from the Declaration of Independence. He quotes Thomas Jefferson about how all men are created equal and have inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, etc. Because he wants a free Vietnam, and he wants America to support that. And Franklin Roosevelt, if you remember, in the Atlantic Charter with Winston Churchill, one of their war aims, one of their goals was to allow nations to have self-determination, which means that nations should be able to choose how to rule themselves. And Ho Chi Minh himself, he compared his work to that of George Washington. He's like, I'm kind of like George Washington. I want my nation to be free, and we haven't been free because of France, France like Britain, etc. So that's kind of the setup there. And but Ho Chi Minh is communist, and that does affect our decision, as does the fact that the French want Vietnam back. So the French want to reoccupy the entire country and go back to controlling it like they did before the war. And we're not really in support of that strongly, but at the same time, we don't have the courage to tell the French to stay out of Vietnam like we probably should have. In part because we didn't want Vietnam to fall to communism, just like Korea, which is in the same time period, China, which had had fallen too. So we're in a predicament where we know that communism is the next great evil after the fall of Hitler, and yet we have a country in Vietnam where we have a leader who's talking freedom and independence, but yet he's a communist who's been influenced by Lenin, and we just don't know that we can trust Ho Chi Minh. So we're on letter D, Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh. So as the French try to reassert control over the country, Ho Chi Minh starts a secret group called the Viet Minh, who are going to struggle against French occupation. And his second in command is a man by the name of Nguyen Vo Giap. And Giap is you see his name actually on page 2. If you flip the page, important people in the war, you have Ho Chi Minh number 1, Nguyen Vo Giap is number 2. You notice there that one of the most popular Vietnamese last names is Nguyen, and it's spelled Nguyen. So you might look at that and say Nguyen, Nguyen, but it's actually Nguyen. So it's kind of like I'm not Vietnamese, obviously, but if you say win, like you win a game, and then it's got a little N in front of it, and win, that's the best I'm going to get. But that's a lot better than saying Nguyen or Nguyen or whatever. So the Vietnamese put their last name first. So if you look in a phone book, for example, you maybe don't even have a phone book anymore, but I used to do this when we still use phone books. Like there's a lot of Vietnamese people live in the Grand Rapids area. And if you look in a phone book and look under the last name Nguyen, there's hundreds of listings because they almost all have this last name, it seems like. Anyway, it's because it's earlier in their history, there was a leader, and I don't know. But anyway, Nguyen Vo Giap was Ho Chi Minh's second in command. He was actually a teacher. He taught French students. His wife was imprisoned and murdered by the French. And so he has this deep hatred of the French and colonialism. And during this time of French reoccupation, he views any Vietnamese that would support the French as his blood enemy. So just like we in the Revolutionary War, we viewed Americans who were loyalists, or Tories who supported the British, as traitors, right? Even though they viewed the Patriots as traitors. So he had this intense hatred for the French because they killed his wife, and any Vietnamese who would support the French. He considered them like the Japanese considered people who surrendered, like the most hated scum. And so he was willing to kill any Vietnamese who supported the French, and he viewed that as his right to do that, his goal. So this is what's setting up here. So you got the Viet Minh led by Ho Chi Minh and Vo Nguyen Giap, who are trying to gain independence for Vietnam and rid Vietnam of the French and of any Vietnamese who would support the French. Well, in the 1950s, the French are trying to control Vietnam, and Vietnam does not want to be controlled by the French. And the French have all kinds of problems at home because the war is over and their economy and country is in shambles because the war happened in France. And so they're trying to figure everything out. They can't hold Vietnam anymore. And so they're asking us to kind of help them and as their ally. And we don't really want to support the French, but at the same time, like I said, we don't have the courage not to. So that's letter E. So Ho Chi Minh is sending us letters begging us to help him. The French are asking us to help them. We're caught in the middle, and we side with the French because we care more about our French allies than we do about the Vietnamese people. And Ho Chi Minh was a communist. If Ho Chi Minh wasn't a communist, I don't, it'd be interesting to see that, what would have played out there. So it's just this difficult thing. Ho Chi Minh's a communist, but he has a passionate desire to free his people, which we understand that. If we were controlled by the French, the Japanese, the Chinese, etc., we would be passionate for freedom too. And so I admire Ho Chi Minh for his willingness to risk everything for the freedom of his people. Okay, so letter F, the fall of Dien Bien Phu, May 7, 1954. This was, you can see this way up in the northern part of the country, right here, Dien Bien Phu. And the French had a fort there, an air base. And this was kind of like their biggest base in Vietnam. And what happened was Nguyen Vo Giap had this elaborate plan. They smuggled in all kinds of weapons and artillery and surrounded the place when the French didn't know it. And then they started this siege of Dien Bien Phu, and it fell. And when that fell, like all the French, it's like all their eggs went in that basket. Once Dien Bien Phu fell, the French really lost control of the country. And at that point, letter G, the Geneva Convention, 1954, they decide that Vietnam should be separated at the 17th parallel, just like Korea. So this is 1954. Korea was in 1950, right? Where they divided Korea right on the parallel, North Korea communist, South Korea free. And then here in Vietnam, North Vietnam communist, South Vietnam free. And then the 17th parallel was the dividing line. So you see that here, 17th parallel divides the country. They were supposed to have an election where the Vietnamese people would vote whether they wanted to be led by Ho Chi Minh or not, but those elections never happened. So what's going to happen is that we're going to get involved in trying to help South Vietnam stay free because we're committed. President Truman was committed to not allowing communism to spread. And then his successor, Dwight Eisenhower, picked up that charge in the middle of the 1950s and then passed it on to Kennedy, who passed it on to Lyndon B. Johnson and then Nixon. So there were all these presidents involved in the Vietnam conflict. So we're going to get involved piggybacking off of the French because we don't want communism to spread. We were afraid that if communism, which already was in China and in North Korea, if it spread into Vietnam and then Laos and Cambodia and Thailand, and who know how far it was going to spread, and we were terrified of that. So letter H, why Vietnam was not another Korea in the big picture. Well, Vietnam and Korea were very different countries. When we got involved in Korea, there was no French colonialism to mess with. It was basically the North Koreans were being controlled by Kim Il-sung, who was a communist puppet of China and Russia. And the people in the South were led by a very strong, sometimes brutal leader in Rhee. And we were there to stop the spread of communism. That's a commonality. But Vietnam had Ho Chi Minh. There was no like independence leader in Korea who had the support of millions of people. Ho Chi Minh had the support of millions of Vietnamese because they saw his passion for independence, not necessarily his communism. Right? The United States looked at Ho Chi Minh's communism first and then his independence movement. The people of Vietnam who'd been oppressed by the French for a century looked at his passion for independence first, and his communism was like an afterthought. So you can see how drastically different Vietnam was because we were fighting against a leader who had the support of the people because they wanted to be free. And so when we took over for the French, because our goal was not to dominate Vietnam and make it a colony, but to a lot of Vietnamese, the difference between the French and the American was like, hey, the French had subjugated us for all those decades. The United States are just going to do the same thing. That was the propaganda message. The United States is just like the French. We weren't like the French. We didn't want to subjugate the Vietnamese. We just didn't want communism there. But we weren't able to communicate that effectively to most of the Vietnamese people. So people who passionately hated the French, like Nguyen Vo Giap, passionately hated the Americans. And so we took the freedom fighting Vietnamese who wanted independence more than their lives, right? They're willing to die as patriots for independence. We made them our enemies because we piggybacked on the French. So we're kind of looking big picture here, and you can see how this is set up for, I don't want to say failure, but just we entered this conflict in Vietnam under terrible conditions. Looking back, it's pretty clear that what should have happened is that we should have allowed Ho Chi Minh to take control of the country, and we should have let things, maybe let things play out a bit to see how he was going to lead. We could have supported him and tried to taper his communism and say, look, we will give you aid if you don't do these communist things, and try to support him and the government and just see how it went. And then if Ho Chi Minh was able to be a good leader, we could have supported that. And if he became a brutal leader who was massacring his people, then we could have got involved after the people of Vietnam saw that Ho Chi Minh and his communism was terrible for the country. See, we had to make a divide between Ho Chi Minh's communism and his independence movement, and we didn't do that. So because we got involved after the French, we made ourselves like the evil French against the independence of Vietnam, which was not our goal. And so we really misplayed this, and that was going to devastate our efforts. Okay, it's super important you understand that, like hugely important. Okay, some terminology, the ARVN, sometimes it's pronounced the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. Those were our allies. Those were South Vietnamese soldiers who fought alongside the Americans, ARVN, okay? American allies. All right, top of page 2, the NLF, the National Liberation Front, also called Viet Cong. Sometimes we would use the term Charlie, communist, Charlie, C. The National Liberation Front, or Viet Cong, were South Vietnamese who supported Ho Chi Minh. So the Viet Minh kind of who fought the French, kind of turned into the Viet Cong who supported Ho Chi Minh and fought the Americans. So Viet Cong were South Vietnamese communists who supported Ho Chi Minh. And I don't even think a lot of them were communists. They just wanted to be rid of foreigners in their country, right? A distinction that we failed to make adequately. The NVA was the North Vietnamese Army. So this was the regular trained army of North Vietnam. So they would work together with the Viet Cong to fight against the Americans and the ARVN, the ARVN, the South Vietnamese. All right, so it's the ARVN and the Americans versus the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army. In the beginning of the war, most of the fighting happened against the Viet Cong. They were supplied by the North, and they fought for Ho Chi Minh, but they weren't part of the North Vietnamese Army. Kind of confusing. All right, important people in the war. Ho Chi Minh, he was the independence leader of the Vietnamese. Already mentioned him. He was a scholar, a brilliant man, great leader, and he definitely had the support of millions of Vietnamese people. And he tried to get the United States to support him. We've been through this, but anyway, a George Washington of sorts of Vietnam. Although he wasn't George Washington. George Washington wouldn't have done some of the things that Ho Chi Minh did as far as violence against his own people. So I don't want to say that they're the same. It's not. Nguyen Vo Giap, we mentioned him. He was the second in command. He orchestrated the victory at Dien Bien Phu against the French. He would run the war against the Americans. Brilliant commander, understood his strengths and weaknesses very well as far as what his men could do. We'll talk more about him. Remember, his wife was killed by the French. He had a deep, passionate hatred for the French and anyone who would support the French, including his own Vietnamese people, and of course the Americans. General William Westmoreland was the American in charge of the Vietnam War from 1964 to 68. He had been in World War II in the Army, fought in North Africa, in Sicily, in Europe. and then rose through the ranks to become general, and was very talented man, and we'll talk about him. But that's his name, American leader in Vietnam from 64 to 68. Then Robert McNamara was the United States Secretary of Defense who advised especially Lyndon Johnson on Vietnamese policy, and you'll be seeing his name too. So that's kind of an overview. If you have questions, email me. Hopefully you have a willingness to learn about the Vietnam War, even in the last week of school. Vietnam War is a passion of mine, so hopefully you will learn something about this war in our short time we can talk about it.